would break on Facebook normally, but I'm not going to because I definitely want to show you these actual graphics. It would be a pity not to do this visually. So over at the Smithsonian, they have the National Portrait Gallery. The National Portrait Gallery has pictures of all the presidents and pictures of all of the first ladies. And they have now unveiled the pictures for Barack and Michelle Obama. So here is the picture of Barack Obama. You see it there on the left. Okay, there is Barack Obama, and he is actually sitting there in a chair that's apparently covered by leaves. He's getting poison ivy. He's being eaten by this like little shop of horrors. He's actually being eaten by the foliage and looking very serious. And of course, this immediately made me think of Homer Simpson backing into the bushes. That is not, of course, the best version of this. Shoshana Weissman over on Twitter had the best version of this portrait. Here's what it looked like. Yeah, there it is. So there's Barack Obama just sitting there in the bushes. It makes perfect sense because the truth is that aside from Obama's talk, the president of the United States was not a particularly useful guy, particularly on foreign policy. He did not forward the ball on foreign policy. He sort of sat there while people got slaughtered in Syria, sat there while Iran developed a nuclear program, sat there while Israel was under siege, sat there during the Arab Spring, sat there as riots happened in major American cities. So I think it's actually a pretty good likeness of President Obama. I think that's not a bad portrait of the president. It's so funny. They're always saying we have to do something creative with the portrait. It's very important we do something creative. So the artists said something about how we wanted to show that Obama's presidency was he the form figure, or was he just being swallowed by history? Was he the driver of history, or was he just a representative of it? And then apparently the various flowers here signify flowers from Kenya and flowers from Hawaii and flowers from Chicago. I don't know what the flower from Chicago is. I assume that it's the opium poppy. But the idea that Barack Obama is sitting there in Wrigley's ivy, in Wrigley Field's ivy, is really weird. He's a Sox fan, supposedly. He's not really a Sox fan, by the way. One of my pet peeves, as I've mentioned many times over, I am a true White Sox fan. Barack Obama could not name one single player on the White Sox when he was interviewed during his 2008 presidential run. A real fan he is. Okay, so that was the picture of Obama. That one was getting mocked pretty relentlessly. That one is not the worst. The worst one is of Michelle. So here's the picture of Michelle Obama. Okay, does that look anything like Michelle Obama? Of course it doesn't look like anything like Michelle Obama. It looks like Regina King, right, the actress. It doesn't look like Michelle Obama at all. And so people were making fun of this. People were getting a big kick out of the fact that the portraits don't look like anything. So naturally, all the lefties came out defending the portraits. They're not supposed to look like the people, they said. Really, this was one of the lines. That these portraits were supposed to be artistic. They're not just supposed to look like the people. Well, then why don't you just put a Kandinsky up there? Right? Now, why don't you just put a Jackson Pollock up there? Just be like a splash of paint and say, this represents Michelle Obama. That doesn't look like anything like Michelle Obama. This is one of my favorite things in the world, by the way, is when people do terrible portraits and terrible statues. As you will recall, I am a huge fan of the Cristiano Ronaldo statue, one of my favorite statues of all time, where he looks like a demented demon sent from hell to torment people. There's a statue of Harry Carey that's just spectacular outside Wrigley Field, where it looks like there are a bunch of faces that are clawing their way out of Hades in order to be lectured about the fortunes of the Cubs by Harry Carey. There's a great one of Walter Johnson, where they tried to make it look like his arm was in motion, and instead it just looks like hell spawn, because his arm is actually like coming out of his body in 5 different ways. It's pretty spectacular. This one ranks pretty high up there. It's like the Lucille Ball statue that looks nothing like Lucille Ball. So well done, National Portrait Gallery. And congratulations again to Regina King for her portrait being entered into the National Gallery. It's very exciting. Congratulations to Homer Simpson as well for being hidden in that picture of Barack Obama. So all of that is very exciting. So in less wonderful news, it now turns out that the Trump administration wants to spend oodles and oodles and oodles of money. So today they offered their budget plan. It is a $4.4 trillion budget plan. Yes, indeed you do. $4.4 trillion. That means it carries nearly $1 trillion deficit each of the next few years. Just awesome. I remember when we were the party of fiscal responsibility. Yeah, that lasted for 5 seconds. One of the fun things about being a Republican, apparently, is you get to scream about fiscal responsibility until the point you get elected, at which point you just blow out the spending. So according to the Washington Post, President Trump on Monday was going to offer this budget plan. It falls far short of eliminating the government's deficit over 10 years, conceding that huge tax cuts and new spending increases make this goal unattainable, 3 people familiar with the proposal said. Eliminating the budget deficit over 10 years has been a North Star for the Republican Party for several decades, and GOP lawmakers took the government to the brink of default in 2011, demanding a vote on an amendment to the Constitution that would prohibit the federal government from spending more than it takes in. That was something the Democrats used to back too. Now it turns out everybody's a liar. House Speaker Paul Ryan, who's a fiscal conservative supposedly, supposedly, when he used to chair the House Budget Committee, routinely proposed tax and spending outlines that would eliminate the deficit over 10 years, even though critics said that this would lead to a severe curtailment in government programs. Because in order for you to actually fix the programs, that means that you have to restructure Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Instead, we're actually expending Medicaid, we're expanding Medicare, and we're expanding Social Security, apparently, in the new budget. In 2013, Paul Ryan proposed $4.6 trillion in cuts over 10 years, an amount he said was sufficient to eliminate the deficit. Those changes were not adopted by Congress or supported by the Obama administration. But now, it turns out Republicans don't care after all. How exciting. They've now jettisoned goals like this since Trump took office. Trump's budget plan calls for a range of spending cuts, reducing the growth of the deficit by $3 trillion over 10 years. It would not eliminate the deficit entirely, said people familiar with the proposal. So what exactly does it include? Apparently, it includes a bunch of new spending on infrastructure. Particularly, they're now putting forth a $1.5 trillion infrastructure budget that would include $200 billion of American taxpayer money being spent on infrastructure. One of the things that's always puzzled me about this infrastructure argument is why not just devolve it to the states? Why not make it California's responsibility to do upkeep on its own roads? The idea that you needed a national highway structure, that you needed Eisenhower's national highway system, is not true, and hardcore libertarians will tell you this. The fact is that Route 66, I've said this before on the program, Route 66, which Nat King Cole used to sing about, right? Get your kicks on Route 66. That used to be a thing because it was a state highway connected with another state highway. Then we built the interstate highway system. And the interstate highway system supposedly made travel that much more convenient, but it made all of these towns ghost towns because they were no longer serving state interests. They were now serving supposedly federal interests. It was a boondoggle. We spent an awful lot of money on the national highway system. Listen, I enjoy driving on the highways as much as the next guy, but the idea that it wouldn't have existed without states is just not true. There are state highway systems, and they just would have connected to one another. So where are these cuts supposed to take place? Well, the budget is expected to target spending cuts at social welfare programs like Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. That's SNAP. That's food stamps. The White House is looking at ways to curb these programs by expanding work requirements for beneficiaries. It's unclear how much changes like this would actually spend. And then there's spending increases as well. $200 billion in federal funds, I mentioned, for the infrastructure plan. $23 billion for border security and immigration enforcement. None of that's going to happen. $85.5 billion for veterans programs. $13 billion over the next 2 years to combat the opioid epidemic. If you want to combat the opioid epidemic, then you actually should curb Medicaid. One of the big problems that they've had is that everywhere that Medicaid has expanded, opioid addiction has expanded because Medicaid actually covers the ability to get cheap opioid painkillers. There have been several studies that have been done on this particular point. Bottom line is that Trump is blowing out the budget. Now, the media's coverage of this is always really interesting because they suggest that this is the end of the world, that he's blowing out the budget. Okay, first of all, this budget is not going to pass. Second of all, the Democrats used to routinely propose budgets like this, just as big, and the media never covered it this way. The media always covered these budget-busting budgets as something fine and decent. It's never a big deal. They're going to spend as much as they possibly can. No biggie at all. It's still not good for Republicans that we are proposing this kind of spending and demonstrative of the fact that Republicans have been lying about this stuff for years. The budget calls for $716 billion in defense spending in 2019 in order to rebuild the military. And again, it includes that $1 trillion infrastructure program. The White House budget assumes economic growth will accelerate from 2.3% last year to 3% this year and 3.2% next year, spurred on by the tax cut. We will see if that is true or not. Even with that assumption of robust economic growth, the federal deficit is expected to increase to hit 4.2% of GDP this year and 4.7% next year. It's usual, as they note, for the deficit to increase during recessions. It is not usual for the deficit to increase during peacetime non-recessions, and that's exactly what is happening here. So once again, this demonstrates this bizarre notion in the American public mind that we like to cut spending when we don't actually like to cut spending, right? We don't actually like cutting spending. We like to pretend that we like cutting spending, and then as soon as someone says, well, I guess we're going to have to cut something, then everybody protests and goes totally crazy over it. Okay, in other news, apparently quick note. There are Republicans who are butting back against this. We'll see if Paul Ryan does. Jim Jordan, one of our favorite congresspeople from Ohio, he came out and he said that the spending increases that were included in the major spending bill that was passed last week by the House, this is unsustainable.
You asked me if there's concerns with the speaker. I think there are big concerns because he just presided over one of the biggest spending increases in the history of this country at a time when we were elected to do just the opposite.
Okay, that, of course, is exactly true. Okay, in other news, it looks like Israel is drawing closer to possible war with Iran. over the weekend in news that has gone largely ignored, except on Drudge Report. Israel issued stark warnings on Sunday over Iran's presence in neighboring Syria after a confrontation threatened to open a new and unpredictable period in the country's 7-year civil war. Israel carried out major raids on Syria on Saturday, including against what it described as Iranian targets. Iran has been using Syria as a thoroughfare to smuggle weapons over to the terrorist Hezbollah in Lebanon. The raids came after an Israeli F-16 fighter was shot down by Syrian air defenses. That was the first Israeli plane shot down since 1982. The pilots were okay. They ejected safely, but they were still, obviously the Syrian forces were still shot down an Israeli plane, an F-16 fighter, which is scary stuff. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, "We inflicted on Saturday a heavy blow to Iranian and Syrian forces. We made it clear to everyone our rules of engagement will not change in any way. We'll continue to harm anyone who tries to harm us. This is our policy. This will remain our policy." Other Israeli ministers spoke of refusing to accept Iran entrenching itself militarily in Syria, as Netanyahu has said repeatedly. Tehran denies that it is doing so. This is one of the holes in the Trump administration policies in Syria. If Iran fills the gap in Syria, it endangers American allies, not just in Israel, but in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt. All of those countries know it. And so the more that Iran exercises and flexes its muscle, the more those countries are going to be forced to take military action in response. That's not Trump's fault, right? He picked up a bad situation in Syria. That's Obama's fault. A picture of Obama receding into the bushes, even that is a little too generous for Obama's policy on Iran, which was not receding into the bushes. It was absolutely handing Iran the pathway to a nuclear bomb, as well as regional power. And that has serious consequences, including for our allies over in Israel, and not just in Israel, but also in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Saturday's events began with Israel shooting down what it described as an Iranian drone that had entered Israeli airspace from Syria. Tehran denied it. On Sunday, Israeli military spokesman Jonathan Conricus alleged that the drone was a copy of the U.S. model captured by Iran in 2011. He said the conclusion was made from analysis of the drone's debris. So they were using the Iranians were using a drone to try and scout out Israeli airspace. Israel responded with the F-16. That was shot down. So things are escalating quickly over there. We will keep an eye on it as it develops.